right, so we're now into this is the third in the series on creating a software solution. This one we're going to talk about building a user experience and the application foundation. Uh, Sort of glancing back a little bit at what we've done so far in the first presentation, we talked about use cases and requirements. And so one of the big things we did is we found a problem to solve. And then out of that, we built requirements and use cases. And then we use those to talk about building a clickable demo, a set of wireframes and some flows and some things like that. Well, once you've gone through your clickable demo, the next step is that we want to actually, build some meat into that implementation. We started it out with the demo. We had a little bit of that. We had some, we'd have some menu items. But if you remember, one of the things we talked about was just sort of throwing links out there or buttons and not really thinking much about navigation. It was more about getting the functionality there so somebody could see roughly how stuff worked, and we come back and pretty it up later. Well, this is where we're going to pretty it up later. This is where we want to build out sort of the core user experience. We're not going to implement in this phase, we're not going to implement everything, but we are going to be getting into implementation, and we are definitely going to lay the groundwork for the rest of the application, for the look and feel, and for the entire user experience. This is the foundation of everything else. So this is, we start with how it looks, how it feels, how you first see the application, how screens interact. That's all, above the level of like maybe like a member data entry screen or something like that. I mean, this is the stuff that flows from page to page, from feature to feature throughout all of the application, and makes it an application and not just a series of functions. You may ask, well, why would we jump into the look and feel so early? Why won't we wait till the end and sort of let it just organically grow? Well, that's, part of the thought would be when we're done, the look and feel, the user experience is woven in and out through the entire application. So if you allow that to organically occur as you're going through and developing things and building the different modules and features, then you're not going to necessarily have that thought in mind. So what you could end up having, especially if you've got multiple developers, is you get up with a product that looks like it's a mutt product. It looks like it was built by multiple developers. When you set some of the rules and standards early on, then all of that stuff will flow through all of the pieces that are built. And no matter how many developers you have, you've got the rules built in there. So it's going to feel like it was done with a consistent thought through the entire process. Now, implementation requires not only use cases, but also, which is the look and feel, that's the vision of how to present those. When we do the clickable demo, we start on that vision. We have some like rough attempts at it. But the way it was built was that there were a lot of those items that we said, well, we're not going to really finish off the vision of how this should work until later. We just want to verify that the functionality works. Well, now we're coming back, we're going to say we're going to really spend some time on that vision. So instead of just it's a screen with some fields, it's going to be it's a page. This is how you flow into it. This is what you see. These are the labels. These are the colors. These are the layout. This is how you navigate into and out of it. All of those things that go into user experience. And of course, with all of this, at the end of the day, if you build a solution that's not usable, if it's not user-friendly, if the customers don't like it, if it's ugly or clunky or slow or 100 other reasons why a customer or an end user may decide they don't like it, that alone could sink even the greatest solution ever. If it's something, and this happens a lot in enterprises where you have internal applications that are built and nobody really, there may be a really good problem that's being solved, but it wasn't built in a way that makes it really useful to the end user. And then the next thing you know, you have these big software projects that have done, they've completed everything, essentially has been signed off on, but then nobody uses it. It's basically shelfware, and everybody goes back to using spreadsheets or paper and pen or whatever it is they were using before, because the interface doesn't just isn't friendly. It's too clunky, it's too painful, and they would rather go back and deal with the problem than deal with the interface. So if you make look and feel one of your primary goals within your project, if you make the user experience part of the good user experience a part of the solution, then you're going to be that much more likely to be successful. So where do we start with all of this? With most applications, we think of it almost like painting a picture. You start with the frame. You start with a header, a footer, a menu, or maybe there's multiple menus, sort of the outline of what the viewport into the application. For example, I've got a couple here. This is one where you can see across the top, you've got basically a sort of a standard little nav bar and some menu items there. Down the left side, you've got some navigation. In the center is where you've got your primary content. Off to the right, you've got some a little advertisement space, and of course, across the bottom, you've got some sort of universal links. How to get a hold of us, things like that. All of this is in some, in a certain type of application. This is very standard. We'll come back to this a little bit later, and we'll look at some of the other little facets of this layout. But now you take the same type of idea and you can go with something like this, which is a very different look and feel to it. Although you've got a lot of the same concepts exist. Across the top, you've got a menu bar. It looks like your content now, as you can see, is more taking the entire screen up once you get out of the header. But then even within that, you can see sort of these, you've got sort of quadrants of, you've got that top little banner, but then you've got these little buttons underneath it. And again, you've got like a footer that's sort of the universal, how to get a hold of us and things like that. Log in and log out. So some considerations as you're building this framework, this frame for your picture, for your solution. We've talked about a couple of these, but in no particular order. One of them is, do you need to have an informational or a message area? For example, going back to this one, maybe maybe you take that center content section and drop that down a little bit and leave it open so there would be a message bar. So your latest success or failure message would then show up there. You may want to do it down on the bottom. You see that a lot with especially like file browsers and stuff like that. Windows sort of made that their standard with Windows applications years ago, that you've got the little micro help bar and the status bar at the bottom so that you'll see some information there. A lot of browsers, you'll see that, where if you do a download, you'll see the little download status will pop up in the bottom. Although again, some of them have changed it up and they'll have maybe a little icon up at the top right that shows that some download is going on in the background. So it's something to consider is, are you going to have a standard message area? Or maybe it's just a pop-up. Maybe you just want to do like a big center of the screen pop-up that's going to be where all of your messaging goes. Is advertising space needed? That's something that we saw in the first one. If you want to have the ability to do advertisement, then you may want to have maybe in the header, you've got a big section to leave advertising open. A lot of places will do it maybe down the left or the right side. A lot of times the right side, because they leave the left for their primary navigation, thinking that people read from top to bottom, left to right. Then they see, probably your logo in the top left, and they start moving down a little bit and they see some navigation options. Moving right a little bit, they're going to see the main content. Then moving right further, now you get into an ad. And then, of course, towards the end, you're going to have just sort of your leftover, maybe universal buttons like, contact us, privacy policy, stuff like that. Things that you want available, but they're low traffic type navigation items. Another thing is, do you want to navigate through a menu or through buttons? The ones we've seen, this one actually has some buttons. You've got the navigation through links at the top, which would be menu items up at the top. But then towards that middle section, you can see we have that search, register, contribute. Now you've got some buttons down there. So maybe that you want to drive it more within the content section. Do you want to have the navigation, or do you want to leave it up at the top in a menu? Button style navigation definitely is going to be, if it's a web application, you're probably not going to use that. You're probably going to use the top nav bar because you don't have a guaranteed size. You don't know if it's going to be a huge screen of 4,000 by 4,000 or a really small 500 by 500 screen. If you're dealing with a native application like a Windows application or a Mac application, and you may want to go ahead and do the buttons. It may make more sense to leave the menus sort of just off to the side and not worry about them, and instead have everybody drive through the center of the screen. With that kind of, and you see that with particularly with certain tools like drawing tools, audio, video editing tools, stuff like that. A lot of times what you'll see is the ability to put a lot of the navigation and functional type things. They may be available in a menu, but they're also in some sort of a little pop-up, like pop-up control bar. For example, think of your font. If you wanted to open up a font menu in, let me pop out real quick. For example, here you may see something like this, where instead of a menu item, instead of just that, you're going to have some buttons and some things you can do. So like if I went down, like here, I may have it off on the side, as we can see in Pages, but I may have this stuff actually as a little pop-up that's sitting around somewhere within the main application. So now another huge piece of really of a web application. Windows and native applications are almost by definition stateful. You will occasionally see stateless applications that exist, but if they are, they're usually like a one-stop, one-shot, very small functionality utility type application. For example, maybe a time tracker app where all you do is you just, it's just you're clicking a button and it's starting a clock, stopping a clock, and you may have a couple features, but there's really no state to it. Most applications, though, it has some sort of a state with it. It knows who you are. It has a context. So it knows maybe what file you're working on or files that you're working on. If you think of like an integrated development environment, if you think of video editing or audio editing software, drawing programs such as like a Photoshop. Photoshop, not only will you have maybe a file, but of course you've got layers that are part of your context. And of course you've got a lot of those cases, you've got just your past actions, so you can undo and redo actions. So there is definitely a state that exists with those. When you move off to a web application, then it's very different. A lot of web applications these days do have a state to them. You log in, you log out. You're in a logged in state and have some options available to you, or you're not logged in, you're not authenticated to the system, and you maybe have a subset of maybe some marketing or some help that you can do, but not any of the main application, because the application itself requires a context. You need to think of that and consider that as you're doing your user experience, because if it's stateless, you can't count on flow. So your user experience is a screen at a time. You can take it as snapshots. However, if you go to a stateful application, flow then becomes a lot of that experience. You have to be able to get, if your wizard or your process is, say, 5 steps, A, B, C, D, E, if your flow doesn't make it easy to go from A to B to C to D to E, and maybe backwards through those and see how you progress, then that can sink the entire usefulness and usability of your application. Universal functions, whether it's stateful or stateless, there's almost every application's got universal functions. They may be things for Windows applications. The most famous ones are like, you have a file menu for probably every application you use. So file open, file close, file save as, the window menu so that you can maximize or minimize. Those are all universal functions. With web applications, you're usually going to have log in and log out. You may have A lot of times you're going to have a privacy policy that's just part of the requirements of having that. You may have a sitemap page, some things like that. You may have online help that you want to have available to every user all the time. All of those are going to be your universal functions. So you need to consider these as part of your user experience. Do I want these in their face? So do I want these at the top of the screen all the time? Looking at our screens, now these were both designed by me, so you can see a little bit my preference is usually, particularly web pages, I'm going to have the universal stuff at the bottom. On this page, I've got privacy home, privacy statement home, which is basically get me back to the starting point, contact us, and log in. This is assuming you're not logged in. This application, you see about the same. There's an about us. You can go to the privacy policy. You can contact us. And, that's pretty much it. It doesn't have a home or a home page link. So you want to think, do you want those in front of them all the time? Do you want them up at the top left menu? Do you want them maybe if you've got a left side menu or a right side menu, sometimes these are at the top of them. At other times, you'll see them all pushed down to the bottom. A lot of times, it's sort of the Web 2.0 world. A lot of times those things exist down in the bottom. There's this big footer. So if you go to just about any page, and we'll go to like, let's say, for example, Dig. I'm sure they do it. Any newsreader site, you're going to see that. If you get far enough down, if they're not infinite scroll, then you're going to get down to their little, their little section, and that's where their universal stuff is, because they figure it's universal. Everybody may want to use it, but they probably don't. And most often that's not going to be clicked on. And that's really the consideration you want to look at. Is this a universal function like login that I want to do every time I get to the application the first time? Or is it something like help that I'm probably not going to use that often? And sometimes you see a blending of these. A lot of times, if you think about any of your favorite applications, like say you go to a banking application, probably if you go to your banking application or if you go to Amazon or some of those sites, the home page has a login button or a login feature available somewhere that's usually fairly visible, fairly easy to get to. Once you get beyond that, the other universal functions are probably across the bottom or a little bit harder to find. They're there, but they're just not used that very often. So you may even want to consider whether you have two cases of universal functions, those which are used frequently and those which are used rarely. A huge consideration that is often left until later in the implementation is varied view options. And by this, I mean things where the views that a user have differ based on maybe their security, their access, or maybe even settings, preferences and configurations that they have done. An application like this one, there's probably not a whole lot of that. I mean, maybe you would take, it's not likely, but it could be, for example, like register doesn't exist, and you would potentially have to take that whole section out, which could be a big impact to your overall look and feel of your page. If you look at this one, you could easily see where maybe if you look at like the name, and then underneath that you've got a display name. Well, maybe display name is only occasionally available. Maybe your website and your email aren't always available. So I think you could easily picture in your mind how that section could expand or contract depending on what values are there. Same thing for that left side menu, is that you could easily have maybe a whole section that collapses out of like it has my account, my data, my connections. You could also have certain menu options that exist or don't exist based on the user and their context. So you want to think about those early on while you're going through your user experience, because if you build out the whole look and feel and everything about your application, and then come back later and start maybe hiding or not including certain controls, options, labels, and fields, suddenly your whole look and feel could really get messed up and could get really squirrely. Universal actions. Some more, we're going to go into each of these things a little more deeply. So our universal actions are things that, as we've said, any user might use at any time. When you're listing out your universal actions and putting those in a section, keep it simple. You don't want to have, and you see this sometimes, you'll go down to that footer section, like dig had, maybe what, 8, 9 items. Sometimes you'll see a footer section that's got 3 dozen items. It's got all kinds of, it's got, jobs, it's got news items, it's got a search, it's got a contact us, it's got columns and columns of stuff, which means there's so many options, almost no user is ever going to use it unless they're looking for it. And of course, that's the most frustrating thing, because they're going to go looking for some specific thing, like I need to find the Bloomin' Contact Us page, and they're having to sort through 3 dozen items to figure out where is the contact page. So keep it simple. Keep it to maybe, I would say, a half dozen would be about your sort of your magical number. You could keep it. 1 isn't going to be too few. Typically, that 3 to 5 range is probably going to be a sweet spot. Maybe up to 6 to 8 items. Something so that it's easy if somebody's looking for something to find it, and they all sort of jump out. Those items sort of pop when you see them in a list. Now you may want to do something like bullet point them. You may want to do some font adjusting or colors or things like that to make them visually pop as well. Logout is going to be anything that's has a login. Make sure there's a logout available everywhere. This is something that I don't know how many, I cannot count how many times an application we've gone all the way through to the end. We're into system testing, and we realize that, oh my gosh, we don't have a real easy way to log out, or maybe no way to log out, which is, as soon as you get testers, they're going to hit that. And it's usually, I don't know that we've ever had it go through to production and deployment, but it's one of those things. It's so stupid simple. Make sure you include that in your consideration. For most applications, you're going to see some sort of view mode changes. Now, like minimize, maximize, maybe a compact versus an extended display. What browsers now with responsive design, that becomes less of an issue because that's just built into it. But definitely if you go with native applications, this is going to be an issue unless you have built it to grow and shrink naturally based on the size of the amount of information you've got. If you've got a data entry application, this becomes the most problematic, because you probably have got it built in a grid. It's probably not a flow layout, and that's part of how it's designed. That's part of the whole user experience. So you maybe have like a 3-column display for your data entry. For example, if we go back to the one we had here, this one it's a flow design, but it's roughly looks like there's maybe sort of a 3-column if you look like city, state, zip. And then it has a few cases where you've got longer fields that does get to a single column. If you've got particularly something that's got a lot of data entry fields, then you may want to have sort of like a small, medium, large option for the display that maybe does single column, 3-column, 5-column, or something like that. And you may also need to adjust the font sizes, the way the labels flow, and some things like that. So make that part of your consideration as you're going through and doing those, whether you need those universal features. Help or contact us is almost always useful, like a help or support. And hide or show data is pretty common, where it may be the most common use of this would be in a search screen where you have a standard or basic or simple search, and you have like an advanced search or something like that. So you may have a situation where you have a high contrast display versus low contrast display would maybe be a universal feature. Also, you may have something where you do detailed information. For example, like maybe you've got lists of data in a lot of your forms, and by default you can set it up that all of those lists are collapsed versus expanded, depending on what the user wants to do. And of course, these may also be user preferences as well. Some notes on navigation. it needs to be easy to find and intuitive. That's why I talked about typically in English speaking and similar languages, your reading is your eyes go top to bottom, left to right. Actually, it's I guess left to right, top to bottom, more specifically. So you want your navigation usually more or less top left, somewhere close to that. So whether it's a top level nav bar where your menu is going across the top, or if it's like, say, a left side, then you want the top of that left side nav bar to be close to the top of the screen. So it's pretty easy to find. You want to make sure that your labels, your menu item names make sense. Look at older versions of Word, Photoshop, and even modern versions, and you're going to see some situations where they have very big, very complex menus, and you can tell that they struggle to figure out where to put certain menu items, which sub menu item belonged under which menu item. So you want to be thinking through all of that and make sure that you have some groupings and something that flows as far as how you navigate, how you label those. Be consistent, particularly we've talked about whether you're stateful or stateless. As you're going through any sort of application, there are going to be menu items that maybe are only applicable in certain situations. For example, you may have a print menu that only exists on reports. All of your other pages, print doesn't make any sense. Make sure, though, that is wherever print is inserted, in the places that it is, that it's inserted in essentially the same order. So if you have like a file print view, then if print disappears, it should be file view. If print's there, file print view. If you go somewhere else and print's there, it should never be a set case where in some cases you have file view print, some cases you have file print view. Some cases you have, and let's say helps at the end of those. Some cases you have like help and then print, things like that. Is keep the order the same so that there is a consistent look and feel throughout all of the different adjustments that you may make. Also, consider the different input devices, particularly mobile devices versus, say, desktop or laptop devices. The smaller screen displays, like the 500, 600 pixel width screens, have a very different ability of, they just don't have as much screen real estate to put stuff in there. Plus, the whole entry may be different. There's a difference between typing on a keyboard and, for most people, if they have to do a little like mini keyboard and use their little thumb entry, and people are getting better at that. And of course, some of these smaller devices have essentially full entry keyboards that they're still painful because they're so small. So, consider those kinds of things. And of course, a mouse and a click and a scroll versus, maybe a touch screen and glide pad and some of those other things. And again, typically you're going to go across the top or to the left for your menus. You may do both. You may have put your universally stuff at the top, and down the left you have something that's more contextual. State versus stateless. Think about the users when as you're making this decision. Do they really need to log in? And more importantly, maybe there's some features they need to log in and some that they don't, because you may have like maybe reporting. Maybe there's some reporting features that are available to everybody that could use to touch that application, and it makes sense for them to just have it. Don't make them log in if they don't have to. As I've mentioned before, usually state versus stateless. If you're stateless, you're probably more of a utility. If you have a state, you're probably more of an application. So utility, you're probably smaller amount of, limited functionality. It may be very powerful, but it's just limited, versus an application. Think like Google, the site is really just a utility. You jump in, you search, it's stateless. It does have a state to it. It remembers more than we want to know about what we've done, but in a real sense, it can be stateless, versus Google Mail, where you need to be logged in because it has that context of who you are and what your inbox is and what you've done with all your emails. Another thing to consider with all of this, especially whether it's state or stateless, you do a save as you go. If it's stateless, it's pretty much by definition, it's probably a save as you go. Although you may want to consider if you've got a long data entry field that's stateless, do you want to do something to allow them to get back to that in some way to cache the work that they've gone through? If it's a stateful application, you probably do. If you're going through, and again, if it's a lot of data entry, more than maybe 30 to 60 seconds of time required to do it, you want to save. You want to be able to save that often, because otherwise, if they go in and they spend 5 minutes entering a form and then something happens, they lose all that work, they're going to be ticked at you, and rightly so, because then they got to go redo all of that stuff, and it's just a pain. Considering that too is whether there's an implicit or an explicit save. As you're going from page to page in a process, you may want to have them have a save button that they have to say, click that, and maybe even they get a warning if they try to move off the page without saving. That's something to consider, is whether that's that's just a natural piece, is that you save when you move, when you navigate off that page, it saves first, or does it require an explicit save because you want to make sure that there's maybe a validation step or some extra work that you want to do, that you want to make sure that they're good with that extra work before you actually start processing it.
A question.
Go right ahead.
Can you be both state and stateless? Is that possible? Can you have a web page whereby both?
You could have, if you do, it's probably it's an application with multiple features, sort of like that initial consideration whether people need to log in or not. If you have some feature, you may have some features that do not require state. They don't have a requirement to know anything other than just you've sent it, you've sent a request and you're off and running. And then there may be other parts of it where like, for example, you may have a data entry portion of an application that requires a state. WordPress is a great example that you may have you have sort of a stateless version of reading a post, if they're reading an article, a blog post. But there's also the stateful thing. If they want to log in, if you require login for comments, then maybe they want to log in and put some comments on a post and maybe reply to. So now you've added a state to it. And it becomes a stateful application. So you could easily have both, and you need to consider that whether you're one, both, or one or the other or both as part of this whole user experience, because that's going to affect things like, is flow something I need to worry about or not? That answer your question?
Yeah, you did. And can you please elaborate more on the difference between whatever utility application and a utility web page as well as an application page?
So an application, really, when I think of utility, and this is, again, like I said, stateless, these are things where they don't care whether you come and go. So if you go to a page that, or you have an application where, like a calculator, it's something where you're entering some numbers, you're getting some stuff back. Maybe if it's it could be something more complex, like a development language emulator. Like if you go out and go to a JavaScript emulator on the web, it's a utility. It doesn't have a state. It sort of keeps up with the code that you're typing into that page, but it's all within that page. Once you leave it, it probably doesn't care anymore. So that would be more of a utility. Application would be something more where you're actually, you have like in web applications, you have an account, you have data that is yours in some way, form, or fashion, and you have like a trackable history of work within that application. So you can, what you bring to the table the 10th time you log in, and what the application provides to you is different from what it does the first time. A utility, it pretty much brings the same thing to the table every time. So like a calendar application. That's beyond a utility because, well, if it's a calendar that just shows me, like say US holidays, that would be a utility. If it's a calendar where I can go in and add appointments and view past appointments, that's an application because the first time I log in, it doesn't have anything. But once I start adding appointments to it, now every time I come in, I have more value because I have all of that value, all of that data I put into it that I can get back out of it. Does that help?
Yeah, very much, very much.
Okay,
Thank you.
not a problem. So continue with the save side of it. Another thing to consider with the save is transactional processes. Is sometimes you would love to save as you go, but the problem is then you have stuff in an inconsistent state or an incomplete state. So although this really gets beyond user experience, it is something that does impact it because you may have a situation where you may have to create some navigation item that's the equivalent of like a, a restart or a rollback or things like that. So those are things to think about through all of this that are maybe not directly user experience, but are definitely at least tangentially going to impact that user experience. And then, of course, with all of this, particularly in stateless, but even in, I guess actually in both, if it's pure stateless, you probably don't have to worry about sharing data and race conditions and things like that because it's just every user can be kept separate. The work they're doing separate. You don't have to worry about it. As soon as you get into stateful, then you may all of those issues can come into play. So, for example, we just talked about a calendar. If I have an application for a calendar and all of my appointments are only seen by me, I'm the only one that can edit it, things like that, then I'm pretty safe. But now what happens if in my application I want to be able to allow other people to view my data? And how do the changes I make affect what they see? For example, if I add a new appointment and they're looking at their calendar and I've shared my data to them, do they see it right away or do they have to do a refresh? Do they have to do a log out and log back in? These are decisions you need to make. Race conditions become a real big issue if you have shared data where multiple people can edit it. So that same situation, I go into an appointment, I share it out with somebody else. If I'm in editing the appointment and they're in editing the appointment, then whoever saves, suddenly you have to worry about race conditions. Is which one saves? Does the first one save and the other one steps on top of it? Is there a check in and a check out or some sort of a locking mechanism? Those are some things that are, again, outside of the visual user experience, but definitely part of the user experience because these are things that it's going to impact that functionality and how users are going to be able to use or not use the application. Because if it's something like if you have the interface set up in a way that essentially all of a person's data is in a single document and they're sharing it with somebody else and both of them can edit it, then you're going to have a lot of issues because it's probably not going to be useful. I mean, think about if somebody's building an application and all of the files that go into an application, if all of that data was in one file and you had a team of developers working on it, how on earth are you going to be able to handle all the edits and make sure that everybody's got what they need at a given time? So think about that. And that's one of those that a lot of times I find that comes up later in the life cycle of a solution. And that's when it's really hard to fix too. Messages and notifications. Swinging back around to this, often you see it in a message bar, either at the top or the bottom. And we sort of know this. It's an interesting thing because it's always there. We almost don't see them, but if they're not there, it's like a hole in our heart. We're missing something. It's like I need to see. If I click save, I want to know that my data saved in some way. And so, think about that as part of the user experience. Be consistent. Put it somewhere so that it's just always going to be there. Their eyes then, if they click save, their eyes will be drawn to where that either success or error message is always going to display. Make use of colors and fonts and keywords because you want them. You don't want messages to become something that's in the way or that's overly obvious. But you also want them. You want it so somebody can just sort of see it, process it, and move on. You don't want to be you don't want it to be something that's a big annoyance, like the common, are you sure you want to do this? Okay. Are you really sure you want to do this? Okay. Those kinds of things where you have messages that become a hindrance, unless that's part of the design. Sometimes you want people to slow down and hinder them a little bit to consider what they're doing to make sure that they don't make a mistake inadvertently. Of course, another huge thing is, do you use pop-up versus inline messages? Do you have a little message bar at the top, or do you have some pop-up window that they have to click OK, or maybe it takes 5 seconds for it to fade away or something like that? Something that a pop-up which is much more in their face and maybe conveys a lot more information. You can put a lot of information in a pop-up. If it's an inline message, you're probably only going to have, limited 1 or 2 lines of maybe 3 or 4 lines of messages. So you're talking, depending on how your lines are set up, 40 to 80 characters, times a couple of lines. Whereas a pop-up could easily be, it could be a pretty big thing. If you think of installing software, the end user license agreements often are a pop-up, and you've got this scrolling document that you've got to get through before you, click OK and accept it and install the software. And then through all of this is you need to think about when you want to actually log messages, when you want to have stuff that's only found in reports, and when you want them to be those live messages. So if I save data, maybe it is. Maybe I feel like every time I save, if it's successful, I'm just let the user assume that if no news is good news. So if I don't pop something up, then don't worry about it. Now, maybe they want to be able to track that or look at it later. So maybe I put it out in a log, or there's a report that can show the history of changes to their data, but it's not immediately available in their face. And that's really a consideration, is think about, is this data that I really want to give to them or, throw out on a screen, or is it something that they were, probably want to see in the future? So maybe I also log it, or is it something they only care about in edge cases, like when something's gone dramatically wrong? So maybe I want it to be a log file or out on a report so they can see an exception report of, when did this data get changed? When did this failure occur? Things like that. Internal applications and a lot of commercial applications, this becomes a non-issue because you're not making money off your advertising, so you don't have to worry about it. Web applications, almost everybody's got advertising in there to some extent. Too much can definitely be a turnoff. For example, the SourceForge site is a perfect example of that. They have got advertisements on the left, on the right. They've got sponsored search results that show up that are at the top, the bottom, and even show up in the middle. Some of these sites, like content sites, you'll see where it gets really annoying that you'll see all these little highlighted linked words throughout the content. So you're reading maybe 300 to 400 word little 2-page essay, and you've got 100 of these little highlighted words that are all basically ads. And if you happen to hover over any of them, you get a little pop-up ad. Those kind of things can be a huge turnoff, and people just say, nope, don't want anything to do with it. So stay simple and elegant. Try it. The advertisers want you to be in their face and something that definitely draws their attention. But if you've got regular advertising, for example, advertising on every page, you don't want it to be in the way. You want it to be something that they can essentially tune out to some level. Hard code advertising space where you can, because especially if you're getting like a feed of advertising and stuff like that, you don't want to have somebody that maybe you've got a little 200 by 200 area for advertisement. You don't want it where somebody throws in this big, 200 by 1,000 banner that suddenly, your advertising space, if it's not hard coded and forces that, then suddenly it's going to, blow everything out of proportion and make your page look like crap. So make sure you're really, last thing you want to do is have your application get all skewed or junked up screen based on advertisers. You may want to consider whether users can turn them off. Maybe it's a paid option. Maybe if you log in, you don't get to see advertising. Also, as a sort of the later bullet point, there's some maybe you only want on certain pages. Maybe there's like your home page. Maybe you don't want to put any advertising there. But once they get further into using your application or your content or whatever it is, maybe that's part of the payment. Is if you're using this, you're going to have to see some ads. And of course, you need to consider whether they're going to be text, are they going to be images, are they going to be video, because all of that stuff may affect your speed, may affect what's your install size if you're installing an application. A lot of kind of stuff like that is that you want to make all of those considerations so that you early on can see the vision of how this is going to look and what maybe some advertisements are going to look like for a user. Further considerations. So every section that we talked about, like the header, the footer, the menus, this should be pretty easy to discern. You may include like line borders, shadows, stuff like that. If we go back, we will see in the first one, you see where you've got these little shadow boxes that are off to the right, essentially, of the left menu. You can see it's got a little bit of like a beveled edge there and a little shadow to the main section. And the right section, you see some colors. You see a black border, horizontal row line there at the very bottom that sort of separates out the footer. So very distinguishable what they are. Even in this one, you can see there's a use of colors and a change between like that main context section, sort of that silverish gray goes into white at the bottom, and of course the red at the top. So you want something that is very visually distinguishing, because what that's going to do is that's going to allow them to draw their eyes to that section as they, based on what their goal is. You may turn on and off sections based by the user, the state, or the process. So like an ad section we talked about, maybe ads don't exist in certain cases. Navigation bars may exist or not based on what pages you're using. A great example of this is report pages. A data entry page may have a lot of menu items and navigation to get through maybe the core functionality of the application. But when you get down to reporting, maybe you've flipped it. So now all you have is maybe some search criteria at the top of the screen, and the rest of the screen is just the report, making it very printer user friendly. So if you do a screen print, you're printing data much more than you're printing controls and navigation items and advertisements and just crud like that. And also consider special cases that vary from the main rules and the requirements. Report's a good example of this. If your application is primarily doing a lot, there's a lot of data entry, a lot of reading and manipulating of data, but sometimes people do reports. Reports become sort of those edge requirements. There's something that people maybe are sort of consider a tack on afterwards. But you want to make sure you consider those as you're building out your user experience. Is that, maybe you have content heavy pages, maybe you have data entry heavy pages, maybe you have search pages, report pages. All of these would be sort of those special cases. And this brings us into what I consider page templates. So, you may have like a dashboard style, which is sort of the, like when I log in, here's my primary things. Maybe I've got some news. Maybe I've got some common tasks like a to-do list or something that I want to see. Maybe I've got a message board that I can see the latest messages that have been sent me from other users. That's your dashboard style template. Informational would be something that's maybe like a help screen or something like that. So you've sort of minimized the navigation, you maximize the content that's displayed on the screen. Data entry and edit, like the first screenshot that we showed, you're going to have some very typical menus, and then you're going to have fields and labels. Again, sort of set up a template of these things, because then it's going to be, once you start building out multiple of these pages, they should have a very familiar look and feel from page to page if they have the same general purpose. Search pages, as I mentioned, And reports, same thing. And searches and reports, in those cases, you're going to have maybe some parameters based for the report or the search, them being simple, very similar as they are. Searches may have filters and sorts. Reports, you may or may not have those. You may not have some of that functionality. And of course, reports you're probably going to want to print out. Searches you're going to want maybe, are you going to have inline links so that you can click on a row and go see a detailed item? Things like that need to be considered. Once you do it in one, though, you should do it across all of those style of pages, those family of pages. So before moving on and getting into all right, we've talked about it, and for getting all this done and getting into that implementation phase, do what you can to create some controls, some code snippets, maybe include files and things like that can be reused where possible. This is going to speed up development. It's going to be part of your template creation. It's going to reduce bugs. It's going to reduce typos. And yes, depending on how you do this, if you change the user experience and the look and feel once you get into implementation, may make things a little more painful because you're going to have to go back and make sure that those controls and code gets updated, gets retested, and all of that. But if you do it right, it should be a couple of changes, and then hopefully you have like a regression test that you can do. So do what you can to set these things in maybe not concrete, but at least something in Play-Doh or putty or something that's a little more firm than just a process document. Start having some, you should have some deliverables coming out of this phase that includes maybe like style sheets, images, resources, stuff like that. Maybe even, like I said, even those templates. And then test. Make sure if you're building controls, test them all over the place. Test them on different forms, different contexts. Test the initial pages. Test navigation among the pages. Make sure that all your controls and everything still works. Make sure that your messages, your notifications are coming up properly and consistently. You've got this stuff. So this is like the next phase of your clickable demo, your clickable prototype. So do the same thing. Put it in front of the user. Same sort of demo story approach. Gather your feedback, because you want to make sure this stuff is as rock solid as possible, because this is your foundation for the rest of your application. If you've got bugs in it, they're going to turn up through the development process, and you're constantly going to be coming back, changing stuff, and it's just going to be a nightmare. So simplifying what we've just gone through. Frame out your sections, set your headers, your footers, your nav areas. Think of it almost like as modules. Maybe even they will physically in the code be modules. Take those things, do some templates, lay out the common types of screens that you're going to have so that you've got a very consistent approach for those. Create your navigation. Make sure that your navigation is consistent from page to page. Make sure that you have it set up in a way that it's easy to turn it on and off if that's a requirement, and that it still flows for the user, and so that they don't get locked into areas where maybe they don't have access to get out of a page that they've gotten into. I've seen that happen where it's like the logout button wasn't accessible to certain people. Suddenly that's a real pain. Create standard controls and scripts. Now that you've sort of laid all that stuff out, get into the nitty gritty of it. Create some controls, create some scripts, and then test. Make sure through all of this that you're gathering user feedback so that as you move forward, you have a really, you're all on the same page about what you're building, you and your end customer, the key stakeholders, and then dive in and start implementing. And it should make all of that easier, because this is where a ton of your design has been done up front. And so when you get into implementation, it's like grab a template, plug and play at that point if you do it right. And that does it. So send any questions, comments, or requests for assistance to info@developernewer.com, or contact us on the site. We're also available to help you through info, through the contact. We're also available to help us we'll help you build your solution wherever you are, whether it's you're working on your use cases, your requirements, your you're here where you're trying to sort of build out your look and feel, your user experience, whether you're towards the end and you're trying to test that stuff out or deploy it out to production. We will eventually get there through this series of videos, but we are also available through those at any time, and would love to help you, and shoot us an email, and we'll do what we can, because we want to just see more software built properly. That being said, any questions?
Yeah. How do you gather like the inputs? Like, how do you come up like with, okay, this is the best, maybe the color coordination, or maybe I need this menu. This is what I mean. How you feel like? How do you get that feel like this is what the customer is looking for, and you sell it to him the way you feel like it's the best way?
Yeah, really, it's theft. I mean, I think that's what everybody does. Is that the you take a look at what sort of what you've got use cases, you've got requirements at this point, so you know roughly what your application is, and so you go out and you look at what other people have done, and you take the best. The best of those, sort of the best breed there. As maybe you've got a certain certain color schemes that you like. You have a certain website or application that you really like how it works. Eclipse is a great example of taking that to an extreme, because you can build applications with it in an Eclipse, and there are a lot of people that have done it where they wanted to build an application. They said, "Wow, the Eclipse framework provides pretty much everything we need, so we're just gonna build within that." A lot of times there's standards too that you'll want to stick to. If you're Windows doesn't really, Windows doesn't care about it as much. Windows apps are all over the place, but Mac applications, particularly if you're going to go to the App Store and provide it, there is definitely a bunch of standards that you have to follow. There's certain frameworks that if you use those frameworks are going to really dictate how you want to lay stuff out and how you want to use it. So, a lot of it is look at things that have been done before, look at the standards that maybe are required for that, the standards that are acceptable for your customers, and look at the other applications that your customers use on a regular basis. Because if they're already using something, then if you build something that sort of looks and feels like that, then it's going to make it that much easier for them to transition to your application. And that's why like NetSuite and Salesforce and PeopleSoft and Bond and all those like huge application suite things that are out there, the enterprise resource management and customer relationships and all that, those tools, they have like a strong suit. They have a core functionality that they do, but you find a lot of them that have allowed people to extend off of that and build like bug trackers and appointment management and stuff like that. That's really not their core functionality, but they have built something extensible because that's what people want. They say, if I'm already really comfortable with the Salesforce way of doing stuff, and my salespeople don't want to learn new applications, then I would rather give them like a time tracking app that is built in that Salesforce environment and has that really consistent look and feel, than go build something that may be cheaper, that's like maybe an Access app or something like that. Because to them, it's going to be jarring for them to go from application to application. Any other questions, comments, or anything like that?
No.
All righty then.